The Shiur tonight is dedicated Lilu Nishmoso of a very, very special person, Moras Rochal Leah Besab Chaim Moshe Koyen, and the Yortzeit is tomorrow night. This is the mother of my dear friend Reb Chaim Olinsky, who is with us here tonight, and he's my brother. My name is Weiss, his name is Olinsky, but in a way we're brothers, not biological brothers, but very, very close, and he's of tremendous help. So the Shiur tonight is dedicated Lilu Nishmoso of Reb Chaim's mother, Rochalea Bes Reb Chaim Moshe Koyen, Shetanuach B'Shalom Al Mishkova. She should be a Meres Yosef for the amazing family. She was a Holocaust survivor, and these survivors, like my own parents, how they found the courage and the strength and the emunah after all they went through to build life again and to establish families. And Baruch Hashem, she was zeicha to Doris Yishorim Evarochim of Talmidei Chachomim, B'nai Torah, dedicated, good Jews. So she should be a Meres Yosef for the entire family. Parshas Chukah, Zois Chukah Satoiro, Rashi brings, Soten, Omesuoila, Moinem Es Yisrael, Mata Mitzvah Chukim Chukarti, Gzeres Gozarti, Ve'ein Lechu Reshus Laharher Achareihem. So the topic we will be discussing today is a huge sugya, but I will only touch upon some fundamentals, and that is taamei HaMitzvot, and the significance, the halachic significance of taamei mitzvahs. And we will be dealing with a broad spectrum. Mitzvahs that the Torah clearly says what is the motive and the reasoning of the mitzvah. Mitzvahs in which Chazal explain what is the motive and the reasoning. Mitzvahs in which we find in the Rishonim. How much weight does the tam have when we come to dictate halacha? So there is a huge controversy between the Rambam and the Rashba and many other Rishonim involved. Are we supposed to try to understand mitzvahs or not? The Rambam at the end of Hilchas Me'ilah, and the Rambam ends each and every one of the 14 Svarim of Mishnah Torah. Probably you're aware of that the last halacha in every sefer is not only clear halacha, it is machshava and musar and chasidus. That is the derech of the Rambam, every sefer. So the end of Hilchas Me'ilah, the Rambam speaks about his hashkafa, his philosophy about taamei mitzvahs, and the Rambam writes a person should try to understand the reasoning of each and every mitzvah. And the Rambam makes his opinion clear once again in the third chelek of Moreh Nevuchim. Almost the entire chelek Gimel Moreh Nevuchim, is dedicated to taamei mitzvahs. And the Rambam expands on his hashkof and taamei mitzvahs in Perek Chovav, and once again in Perek Mem Zayin. The Rashba in Tshuva disagrees with the Rambam, and the Rashba quotes a medrash that is found twice in Parshas Lech Lecho and once again in Parshas Shmini. And the medrash says, "V'chi ma ichpas lo laKadosh Baruch Hu ben shochet min hatzavar leshochet min haorev. Lo nitnu mitzvot ela letzarev behem et habriot." Really doesn't make any difference whether you're shecht from this side or from that side, from the neck or from the back of one's head. It doesn't really make a difference. Lo nitnu mitzvot ela letzarev behem et habriot. And the Rashba rejects this entire endeavor of taamei mitzvahs. Many Rishonim follow the footsteps of the Rambam. Amongst them, very famously known, very well known, Sefer HaChinuch. And in each and every of the Taryag mitzvahs, the Chinuch writes Shoshei mitzvah. What is the shorish? What is the reasoning of the mitzvah? The Rashba has his hashkafa. And in Tshuvas Rashba Chelek Aleph Siman Tzadik Daled, the Rambam writes, of course, yesh taamei mitzvahs, but it is not for us to try to figure out using our own mind and attitude what are the reasoning of mitzvahs. But twice in Shas, Bov Metzia Kuftos Vov, Senedrin and Chof Alam in the base, we find the Machlokes Reb Yehuda Reb Shimon Darshinan taamei dekro or lo Darshinan taamei dekro. And one Machlokes is regarding Lo Yisachbol Rechayim V'Rochem, the Isser of taking a mashken from an almana, and that is one sugi in which Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon has a disagreement, a dispute whether Darshinan taamei dekro, and the other is Lo Yarba Lo Noshim, Melech Yisrael. Lo Yarab B'lei Noshim, and these are two sugis in which we find a machlokes tanoim. The Rambam, in both cases, Malva V'Loiva, Gimel Tezvav, and Hilchas Malachim Gimel Halacha Beis, both regarding Dina Mashkin, that is Malva V'Loiva, and Lo Yarab B'lei Noshim, that is Hilchas Malachim. In both cases, the Rambam paskins in accordance to Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Darshinan taamei dekro. And that goes back all the way to the Rishonim. The Bach, twice, in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Siman Ches in Hilchos Tzitzis, Tov Reish Chof Hei in Hilchos Sukkah. The Bach says, there are 3 mitzvahs, and only 3, in which the Torah clearly says what is the reasoning of the mitzvah. And by these 3 mitzvahs, exclusively, besides the general kavanah to be makayim a mitzvah, because we pass a mitzvah sichas kavanah, you also need a detailed specific kavanah, an additional kavanah. So when you sit in the sukkah, you need to bear in mind, Laman yedu d'rosechin kibesikas hashafti es b'nei Yisrael boitzi yoysa meyeres Mitzrayim. And when you wear tzitzis, you need to bear in mind, Uri isam oisoi, Laman tiskol v'osiso eskol mitzvos, and you should be makayim all the mitzvahs. And even though the Rambam, the Bach doesn't say it in Hilchas Tefillin, but the 3rd mitzvah is Tefillin, Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha. Laman tizkeru by tzitzis, Laman tizkor by sukkah, Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha by Tefillin. And therefore the Bach paskins. These 3 mitzvahs, besides the general kavanah, that you're makayim a mitzvah, and you want to be yotzi yedei chayva, you need an additional kavanah. The reasoning of the mitzvah. And it's a machlokes prima godim and B'kuri Yankov. Is this additional kavanah makar b'diavad, or is it only lechatchila? The prima godim maintains it's lechatchila. B'kuri Yankov is a wonderful sefer of Yankov Ettlinger and Hilchos Sukkah Tov Reish Chof Hei. He says it is ma'akev even b'diavad. And another opportunity, not today, because we have a lot to discuss today, but Bezrat Hashem, even though I'm taking a big break, but Bezrat Hashem, Kodesh Baruch Hu should help us all. We should have many, many more opportunities. We will get back to these sugyas. And I have a very long siman that I wrote. Are there only 3 mitzvahs and no others in which the Torah clearly states what the reason of the mitzvah is? And I differentiated between taamei mitzvahs and tachlitan shel mitzvahs. There is a difference between a reason and a goal and an objective. It is only when the Torah clearly says what is the objective, not the reasoning, not why, but where is this mitzvah supposed to take us. Lo taamei mitzvot ele tachlitan shel mitzvot. And it is only when the Torah says, Leman tizkeru, Vasisem es kol mitzvos Hashem, Leman tiyeh Hashem ficho, Leman yedu dorasechem ki besukkah shafti es b'nei Yisrael. So the Torah clearly says, I want you to sit in sukkah because I want the sukkah to remind you. So it's not only like Shabbos, which is Azeicha Lamasa Bereishis. The Torah says where this mitzvah is supposed to take you. And it is only when the Torah clearly explains tachlitan shel mitzvot that you need to have this special kavanah. Lo tzarich lachaven taamei mitzvot, tzarich lachaven letachlitan shel mitzvot. And there's a difference between the reason we perform mitzvahs and the objective or the goal. What do we need to achieve by performing these mitzvahs? So I briefly just related to the sugya, which goes all the way back to the Mishnah, the machlokes of Yehuda Reb Shimon, Darshinan taamei dekro, and that machlokes is Could the greatest of Tanoim that had Ruach HaKodesh, could they be Dorish Taamei Dekro? And then we discussed the Bach, that when the Torah says what the reason of the mitzvah is, then we need to bear that in mind when we perform the mitzvah. And now we come to the main focus of today's shiur. When we find taamei mitzvahs in Rishonim or in Balei HaKabbalah, what significance do these reasons have in halacha? We start with Chazal and we move on to the Rishonim. Shiluach haken, shalach teshalach hasem v'sabonim tikach lacha. So the Mishnah says in Brochas Lamed Gimel Amid Beis, a Masechet Brochas is all about Tefillah and Brochas and Kriyas Shema. Hu oimer al ken tzipor yagia rachamechu mishat ken oisoi. You are not allowed to say in your tefillas, Rabbani Shalom, you have mercy on the birds, have mercy on me as well. Hu oimer al ken tzipor yagia rachamechu mishat ken oisoi. And there are two reasons in the Gemara. Lama mishat ken oisoi. Why is that not legitimate? Why can't you turn to a Kodesh Baruch Hu and say, Al ken tzipor yagia rachmechu, so have rachamim on us as well? Reason number one, oisa midosav shel HaKodesh Baruch Hu rachamim ve'enom elo gezeiros. Who told you that the reasoning of shalach teshalach hazem is mercy? Maybe it's just a gezeira. The Torah doesn't say why. The other reason is, matlekina b'maaseh bereishis. You're causing envy between Kodesh Baruch Hu's creatures. The Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah Perek Tes Halacha Zayin quotes only one of the two reasons. Oisa midosav shel HaKodesh Baruch Hu rachamim ve'enom elo gezeiros. But the Rambam himself in Moreh Nevuchim, Chelek Gimel, Perek Mem Ches explains the mitzvah of shiluach haken is because rachmav al kol ma'asov. Does the Rambam go against the Mishnah and the Gemara in Brochas Lamed Gimel? Because, as I mentioned before, Chelek Gimel of Moreh Nevuchim is primarily about taamei mitzvahs, and in Perek Mem Ches, the Rambam explains what is the mitzvah of shiluach haken all about? Rachamei Shamayim. The Ramban, Parshas Kiseitzai, Perush Ramban al Torah, differs slightly with the Rambam, and the Ramban's approach is it is not about a Kodesh Baruch Hu's rachmim, but a Kodesh Baruch Hu wants to instill in us midas rachamim. It is not because a Kodesh Baruch Hu cares, but a Kodesh Baruch Hu wants us to be people of compassion, of caring, not only to our fellow Jews, not only to our fellow human beings, but even to every living creature. So both the Rambam and the Ramban understand the mitzvah of shiluach haken as a manifestation of rachamim. The difference between the two is it a manifestation of a Kodesh Baruch Hu's rachamim, v'rachmav al kol ma'asov, or it might be hadbeg b'midosav mahu rachum af atu rachum. But both the Ramban and the Rambam both explain that shiluach haken does have to do with rachamim. Do they go against the Gemara? So the Tosfos Yom Tov and the Mishnah says, you cannot make the statement in your tefillas, but b'derech drash v'b'derech pshat, it is legitimate. So the Tosfos Yom Tov justifies all those that are doirish taamei HaMitzvot. Because the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, as well as the Sefer HaChinuch, quite a few times in his Sefer, and also in the introduction to a Sefer, both the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch say clearly, we do not say Kazera Eva Kadesh, Lo alinu l'shamayim, Lo shamanu k'moishe mepi agvura, that these are taamei mitzvot. We use our feelings, our attitudes, and our, I might say, it's not what they say, their Ruach HaKodesh to suggest these might be taamei mitzvahs. And the reason we espouse these taamim is lahaliv es alev or lesaber es oizen. The Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch feel when you try to identify with the mitzvahs and you understand why you're doing these mitzvahs, You will do the mitzvahs with more passion, with more feeling, with more dedication, not just doing things without understanding what you're doing and why you are doing. And therefore, so the Tosfos Yom Tov makes a distinction. It is totally legitimate, b'derech pshat, b'derech drash, to try to explain mitzvahs. But when you daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you cannot say, haken tzipo yagia rachmechu. Your tefillahs are definitive. You don't turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, maybe you have rachamim on the birds, or have rachamim on me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say, well, maybe I'll have rachamim on you as well, because you say, maybe you have rachamim on the birds. So the Tosfos Yom Tov makes a distinction between saying haken tzipo yagia and tefillah, but it is legitimate. The Rambam and the Ramban, two different approaches. What is shiluach haken all about? Tikunei hazoyer tikun vav. The Zohar has a totally different explanation on shiluach haken. And I do want to draw your attention to a difference. The philosophers spoke a lot about taamei mitzvahs, starting off with the Rambam. The Rambam was the greatest Jewish philosopher. And the Mekabolim deal with taamei mitzvahs. The difference between the two is the philosophers clearly say, this is what we might suggest. The Mekabolim say, this is what we have b'Kabbalah. This is Torah's emes. This is Kabbalah. This is not just suggesting. It's not just what might be. And that is a fundamental difference between the Zohar and the Ari and taamei mitzvahs that are suggested by the Rambam and Moed Nevuchim or the Sefer HaChinuch. So the Zohar and Tikunei HaZohar Tikun Vav. I don't know whether you're familiar what Tikunei HaZohar are. Shivim Tikunim. 70 essays. I can't find a more appropriate word. I don't think the Zohar Kodesh wrote essays. Shivim Prokim. B'Lashon HaZohar, Shivim Tikunim, and all our interpretation of the first word in Torah's Moshe, Bereshis. One word, Shivim Tikunim. We could just imagine if there are Shivim Tikunim of every word in Torah's Moshe, what that would add up to. But Tikunei HaZohar are Shivim Tikunim, all on one word, Bereshis. Not even Borah. So, Tikun Vav, the Zohar says, when we send away the mother bird, she is pained, and she misses and she longs for her children. Knesset Yisrael leyoyne imsalo, and that is ma'orer HaHashchina, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu longs for his children that are in Golus. And that is what the mitzvah of Ken Tzipor is about. So according to the Zohar, it is not to minimize the pain and suffering of the mother bird. It is to cause her pain and suffering. We send her away, she should miss her children, the Gozelim or the Efrochim. And when she is pained, that is Ma'orer Gaguai HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Shechina on Knesset Yisrael Shebegolos and Shechinta Begelusa. What would be the nafamina in the halacha between the two different approaches? So the Achronim deal at great length. Is this a mitzvah chiyuvis? Whenever you find a ken tzipor, you need to send away the mother and throw away the eggs or do whatever you want to do? Or is it only if you want to eat those little birds, or you want to cook the eggs, you want scrambled egg, you want to eat the eggs? In that case, you need to send away the mother. Most of the Achronim, most notably the Chassam Sofer, Tshuvas HaChaim Siman Kuf, Sefer HaMakna, one of the greatest Gedolim of his era. He was actually the Rebbe of the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer was the Talmud of the Hafla, and the Hafla was the Masechet Ksubas, Sefer HaMakna, Masechet Kedushin, at the end of Perek HaMet Kedushin, Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. Chazon Ish, and these were three giants. The Chazon Ish in Kuf Ayin Hey Yeredea are the Beis. These three giants say there is no mitzvah at all in shiluach haken unless you want to eat those eggs. You want to take advantage. You want to take those birds and either grow them up or eat them. But if you have no need for those eggs, the Chassam Sofer writes it's midas achzorius. Why would you destroy this family, this bird family. But according to the Zohar, no, it is an inyan, regardless of whether you have any intention of taking benefit from those eggs or those little birds. It is a mitzvah dafka to be mitzvah the mother and to be ma'orer gaguei hashchino. So the Sam Sofer writes, he brings the Zohar, but he writes, the Zohar is Kabbalah. And we do not paskin in accordance to Kabbalah. And therefore, the psak of the Sam Sofer is, you only have a mitzvah if you have an intention to take benefit of those birds or those eggs. Otherwise, there is no mitzvah at all. So this brings our attention to an afkaman and halacha that there is between different approaches and mitzvahs. So the classical understanding would be the understanding of the Chassam Sofer of the Sefer Makna of the Chazon Ish. Now, when the Chassam Sofer rejects the Zohar, he has a kasha. Hatinach, when Eden are in Golos. But the mitzvah is eternal. And the Torah was given also in the days of the Beis HaMikdash. So the explanation of the Zohar doesn't fit in, doesn't make sense when Shechina Shoyre B'Yisrael and Eden are not in Golos. And this is a shtickle pele. Obviously, the Chassam Sofer didn't see the Zohar. And he was aware of the Zohar from Tshuvas Chavas Yoher. The Chavas Yoher was the first that deals with this question regarding shiluach haken. And the Chassam Sofer quotes the Chavas Yoher. So the Chavas Yoher doesn't quote the Zohar in its entirety. But the question the Chassam Sofer asks on the Zohar, Rabbi Elazar ben Reb Shimon asked his father, and it's in the same paragraph in the Zohar, in Tikkun Vav, when Reb Shimon said that the reasoning of shiluach haken is la'orer tsar hashchina. Rabbi Elazar asked him, and what about the days of glory in which Shechina Shoyre B'Yisrael? And Reb Shimon responded, it is to be oirer mishamayim al neshomes hatois that are somewhere out there and not finding their proper place in the world to come. So Reb Shimon answered this question. And the one that asked the question is Rabbi Elazar ben Reb Shimon, his great son. And the Chassam Sofer asked this question on his own, and that is the reason that he rejects the Zohar. So obviously the Chassam Sofer didn't see the Tikkun Zohar. He just relied on the Chavas Yoher that quotes the Zohar. So the Chavas Yoher deals with this question, and he doesn't reach a verdict. But the Chassam Sofer, the Makna, and the Chazon Ish do give a psak. There is no mitzvah unless you have intention and you want to take those eggs for your own benefit or those little birds. And this is one example that there should be an afkaman halacha l'maisa between taamei and mitzvahs. And the Chassam Sofer says, we don't paskin in accordance to the Zohar. Example number 2, which is a mitzvah which is extremely relevant. We all have mezuzahs on our homes. And the Gemara says, Psocham Dav Daled, Menoches Bava Metzia, Mezuzah Choyves Adar. You might have 10 houses. You're not required to put a mezuzah only in the house in which you live. As long as you don't live in a house, you do not need to put up a mezuzah. This halacha is not mefurish b'Torah. It is Chazal. Because Uchsaftam al mezuzah is Beisecho. Beisecho is your home. Does your home mean the home you live in, or does it mean a home in your possession? So the Gemara says, Choyves Adar. Rashi Psocham Dav Daled has 2 pirushim, 2 interpretations. Why is Mezuzah Choyves Adar, and why is there no mitzvah unless you actually live in the house? One explanation is it's all about shmira. And if you don't live in the house, you don't need any shmira. You need a Kodesh Baruch Hu to watch over you and watch over your home, over you and your family and your possessions. But if you don't live in the house, then you don't need shmira. How do we know that Mezuzah is all about shmira? It's not even mefurish b'Torah. Nowhere. So this would be an example that Chazal dictated halacha based on taamei mitzvahs. And taamei mitzvahs that are not mefurish b'Torah. Nowhere in the Torah is there any indication that Mezuzah is about shmira. In Chazal, it is clear. that Mezuzah is Shmira. But how would we know it's about Shmira? So we find both in Bavli and in Yerushalmi, Mezuzah definitely is Shmira. Menoches Lamed Gimel Omed Beis, the Gemara says, Loike midas HaKodesh, midas Bosav Adam, midas HaKodesh Baruch Hu. An earthly king, he dwells in his palace, va'avodov misham ramoisa mebechutz. Kodesh Baruch Hu is the king, and his servants dwell in the palace, and the king misham ramoisa mebechutz. So Chazal say, what is Mezuzah all about? An earthly king, Bosav Adam, blood and flesh, the king enjoys his privacy in his huge palace, and his servants need to sweat it out there in the heat and the cold and put their lives in danger just to protect their king. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu lets us sit inside in comfort. And the Mezuzah, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Misham Eloheinu B'chutz. So the Gemara clearly says, Mezuzah provides Shmira. But the Gemara doesn't say that that is why we need to put up mezuzahs. That might be a result of mitzvahs mezuzah, not the reasoning of mitzvahs mezuzah. In Yerushalmi, we find an interesting story. Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, Masechet Peah. Rebbe had a Gentile friend, obviously a Roman. His name was Artavon. And Artavon was a friend of Rebbe. And he sent Rebbe a precious gem, which cost a fortune. And Rebbe responded, he reciprocated, and he sent him a Mezuzah. And Artavon was either angry or amused. We don't know. But Artavon asked Rebbe, do you know how much the gem I sent you costs? It costs a fortune. And you sent me a piece of parchment. Is that reciprocal? I mean, is that symmetrical? And Rebbe responded, you sent me a gift. I wanted to spend a lot of money to watch over this gift. And I wanted to take out insurance. But what I sent you is going to watch over you and your family. And you're going to be safe. So we find both in Bavli and Yerushalmi that Mezuzah provides Shmira. But that doesn't mean that is the reason that Kodesh Baruch Hu required Osaftom al Mezuzah beisecho uvish'orecho. And Rashi says, and that is a chiddush of Rashi, but Rashi explains the Gemara why Mezuzah is choyves adar, because it's about Shemira. But Rashi also offers a different explanation why Mezuzah is choyves adar, and according to explanation number 2 in Rashi, it is gzeres hakosov, beischa derech bi'oscha. And Chazal say, how do we know Mezuzah biyamin? Derech biyascha. Ki oker inish raglei, he usually puts his right foot forward. And if it's derech biyascha, it is only in a house in which you dwell, in doors which you open and close, a house you live in. So there are 2 pshotim in Rashi. Why Mezuzah is choyves adar? Is it gzeres hakosov, hilchaso below taamei, or is it because of Shemira? In the Zohar, we find 2 different explanations, Pashas ve'eschanan in Zohar. Either, and that is also in the Rambam, people should not be Mesiach Das from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Every time you walk into the house and every time you walk out of the house, you should remember Re'isa Moisei Zachartem, the same as Tzitzis, to remind you, you are Avdei Hashem. And that is where the minute comes from. When we come into the house, when we leave the house, we kiss the Mezuzah. We kiss the Mezuzah because we just want to say, yes, we realize, we remember. So one explanation of the Zohar regarding Mezuzah is just to remember that you're Avdei Hashem. There's this famous Gemara that we find both in Bavli and Yerushalmi. Menoches Mem Gimel and Bavli at the end of Masechah Brochas in Yerushalmi. Sheva b'yoyim halal ticho. Pa'amachas David was bebeis hamerchatz, and he said, Oili sha'ani orum min mitzvos. Which mitzvos? Sheva b'yoyim halal ticho. Tzitzis is 4. Kanfi aksus. Tefillin is 2. Tefillin shel yad, tefillin shel rosh. 4 plus 2 is 6. Mezuzah is 7. And David HaBeis HaMelech says, Oili Shani Oram, and he says, Niskar b'milosoi v'niskar rodatoi. So the Beis Halevi, the Pri Yitzchok, and many others say, why is he Oram in HaMitzvos? I mean, he's Makayim Mezuzah back home. After all, he's in the Merchez now, but he lives home. He has a Makeh b'rosh gagoi. There are so many mitzvahs that a person performs on a steady basis. So lefi pshutam shel devarim, these 7 mitzvahs are unique. They're on your body, on your garments, on your home. And that is what you are engaged with from day and night, from morning to evening. So tefillin is what you wear on your arm and your head. Tzitzis is on your garments. Mezuzah is on your home. And the essence of these 7 mitzvahs, there are actually 3 mitzvahs, but they break down to 7. The essence of these mitzvahs is to remind you that you are an Eved Hashem. Al tasiyach dat. Remember who you are and why you are here. And that is what these mitzvahs are all about. So, the Zohar gives one explanation. Mezuzah is all about remembering. And the other explanation is Shmira, like Rashi. So this is another example in which we find taamei mitzvahs which dictate halacha. Not halacha that the Rishonim or Machadash or the Poskim, but rather Chazal. And according to Rashi, one of the 2 explanations, Perushim in Rashi, why do Chazal say Mezuzah Chovis Adar? And you don't need to put up a mezuzah only in the home in which you live, because it's about Shmira. And that is somewhat of a chiddush. Example number 3. Lo ta'achilum. Yavamas Kuf Yud Daled is a big sugya. And the Poskim, it's full. Kota noichal avela saying beis de mitzuven lahafrishoi. Lo safina le biyodayim, but you cannot give cheresh, shoita, v'kotten, and avera biyodayim. So if you see a little child, Machal Shabbos, you don't need to intervene. You don't need to try to prevent them. Unless you're the father. As a father, you have a mitzvah of chinuch, but you're a stranger, a neighbor. You don't need to intervene. But you're not allowed to feed a kotten macholas asuros, or to cause him directly to be Machal Shabbos. And we learn this halacha from Lo Ta'achilum. Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, or Chaim Semepei Gimel. The Chasam Sofer has a lengthy discussion. A child that has limited mental capacity, cognitive capacity. And by halachic criteria, he is defined as a shaita that is potem in a mitzvahs. Because parents put him into institution in which they will feed him treifus, and he will be Machal Shabbos. This is a painful question. In days of yore, there were no institutions for the mentally handicapped, which were al taharas hakodesh. We try to pretend that it doesn't happen in our camp, but it happens in every camp. Baruch Hashem, today there are many institutions, whether it's in Israel or Europe and America, more in Israel than anywhere else in the world, in which, yes, there are installations, there are institutions which care for our children, whether they're physically handicapped or they have limited cognitive capacity or mental capacity. But the question that Chasam Sofer was dealing with was, could you put a kid into an institution in which they're machal aveis treifus? And the main focus of this tshuva is putting a child into an institution of this nature. Is that defined as ein lahachiloi biyadayim or not? You know, I'm just putting him in the institution, but I'm not going to feed him. I'm not going to be there by breakfast or lunch or dinner. So the focus of the tshuva is, how do we define lo safina le biyodayim? But the Chasam Sofer also deals with Trumas Hadeshen. Trumas Hadeshen is one of the greatest Rishonim, Ashkenazi Rishonim. Siman Samach Beis, Trumas Hadeshen says that the reason the Torah asks feeding a child macholas asuras or causing him directly to violate any other avera, any other mitzvah is he shouldn't get used to it. He shouldn't be accustomed, and then it'll be hard to wean him off when he's going to be an adult and he's going to be chayav b'mitzvahs. So there's some Sefer argues, according to the Tumas Hadeshen, if we know that this person will never be chayav b'mitzvahs, then there should be no problem. Then this halacha would only it would only be relevant to a cotton that at some stage is going to become an adult, is going to be chayav b'mitzvahs, and then we'll have a real problem to wean him off his habits, his bad habits, to be over avera. But if we know by medical knowledge that he will never be chayav b'mitzvahs, then there should be no issur. But then the Chassam Sofer says, lo darshin and taamei dekro. And we cannot dictate halacha based on taamei HaMitzvos. And how does the Tumas Hadeshen know that this is the reason? And I wonder, and I am putting up an argument against the Chassam Sofer, offer ani tachas kapes laglav, aval kach yidaka shel Torah. I think there's a huge difference between taamei and mitzvahs that we find by the philosophers, like the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim or Sefer HaChinuch, or even by the Mekabolim, like the Zohar regarding shiluach haken, and taamei and mitzvahs that we find in the poskim. So the Tumas Hadeshen is one of the greatest poskim. So why does he write what he writes? It's not written in Ramban ala Torah. It's not written in Sefer HaChinuch. It's written in Tshuvas Tumas Hadeshen. Tshuvas Tumas Hadeshen is halacha. So how does the Chassam Sofer reject a tshuva in Tumas Hadeshen, one of Rabbi Seinu Rishonim? And this brings me to argument number 2 against another Chassam Sofer. And now we move over to sugya number 4. Schora b'macholos asuros. Siman Kuf Yud Zayin and Yoredeya. Very brief introduction. Macholos asuros are divided into 2 categories. Some macholos asuros are also b'achila v'mutar ba'anoah. And that would be the majority of macholos asuros. Nevela, treifa, minim tameim. Many other macholos asuros, also b'achila mutar ba'anoah. Some macholos asuros are also b'achila ubahanoah. Which ones? Orla and kila eakerem. Bosa macholav is a machlokes chachamim v'Reb Shimon. So there are 2 different categories of macholos asuros. Some are osa b'hanoah, isurei hanoah. Most of them are osa b'achila, mutar b'hanoah. However, all the macholos asuros are osor b'schoiro, which means it's not osa b'hanoah, but you cannot base your parnasa on a business selling macholos asuros. And that is why the Mishnah says in Tumas, so if you are a fisherman, and usually fish stick together, and you catch salmon, or tuna, or carp, or whatever fish, but sometimes you fetch a lobster, or catfish. I remember in the Catskills as a kid, we used to go fishing. 90% of the fish we caught were catfish. But sometimes we got a kosher fish as well. So if you fish primarily kosher fish, but sometimes you get a sheretz or a dag taamei, you're entitled to sell it because it's not your business. The issa schoira is not benizdamnu lo. That's the lotion of Chazal. Nizdamnu lo, you could sell because it's not osa b'hanoah. It's mutar b'hanoah, osor b'schoira. And there's a machlokes poskim. It's a schoira. Is it min haTorah or min derabanan? The Gemara dashes schoira from a posuk in Pesachim Daf Chov Gimel. The Rashban Tshuva writes osa min haTorah, and it's a chiddush. Mutar b'hanoah, osor b'schoira. How do we explain this? Tshuvas Rashba, Chelek Gimel Tzimareish Chov Gimel, the Rashba says, why does the Torah asa schayre b'machonas asuris? Because if this is your business, you might forget and consume and eat. So you have a makolat, or you have a bakery, and you're selling non-kosher food. You have a restaurant. This is your business. You're not going to eat there because it's non-kosher food, but you might forget. Or one of your kids might forget. Or one of your kids might be tempted. Delicious food, great aroma. And laharchik is odem and aveira, the Torah says, it's not osa b'noam, osa b'schayra. Comes along the some soif at Shuvas Yoradeh, and he says, according to the Rashba, if the food you're selling is not at all fitting for consumption, you have a butcher shop. It's not a restaurant. It's not a fast food takeaway. You're selling raw meat. So there is no chashash, you're going to be nichshal. You have an investment. You have a factory or a huge chain of supermarkets in Hong Kong. You live in Yerushalayim. You're never there. What would be the Issa? So according to the reasoning of the Rashba, that the Issa Schayra is Aharchoki, you shouldn't be Nichshal, maybe there would be room for leniency when it is totally impossible you should be Nichshal, either because your store is 10,000 miles away or because you're selling raw material that is not at all fitting for consumption. But then the Chassam Sofer says, Lo darshinan taamei dikra. So we can't be makel in a mitzvah d'oraisa based on taamei mitzvot. And I ask once again, but this is Tshuvas Rashba. It's not Moed Nevuchim. It's not the Zohar. It's Tshuvas Rashba. So Rashba was one of the greatest Rishonim. And if it's not relevant in halacha, why does the Rashba write it in Tshuvas Rashba? So Ibid Italia, I would argue we need to make a difference and a distinction between taamei mitzvahs that we find in the philosophical works and even in Ramban al-Torah or even in Zohar HaKodesh. But Trumas Adeshen, Lagabe Lo Yisachilum, and Tshuvas Rashba, Lagabe Yisachira, would be different. These are the greatest poskim. These are the Rishonim. However, I would make another argument against the kula, lo plug. Not always does the reason dictate the detailed halachas. And even if the reason the Torah answers, Machoras Asura says, Sheloi nikoshel ba'achilas isur, doesn't necessarily mean that the reasoning will dictate the details. Umisha asro chachomem schayra, the isser is across the board, and it no longer is dependent on the reasoning of the isser. So that would be my argument against kulas based on the Tumas Adeshen regarding Safina Levi Yudayim, or kulas based on the Rashba regarding isser schayra b'machoras asuros. But that would be an argument of a different nature, not because lo darshinan taamei HaMitzvos. Taamei mitzvahs that we find in the Mekabolim of the philosophers, I totally agree, have no relevance in halacha. I feel it might be different when we're dealing with the Tshuvas Rashba or Trumas Adeshen. Do we have a clear source that Chazal sometimes did dictate halacha based on svara? We do. And that is Bava Metzia Daf Tzadik. Lo tachsem shor bedishoy. That is a lav. And the Gemara in Bava Metzia Daf Tzadik says, Hoyso behema matrezet. The behema had diarrhea, and it is ill. And we know that letting the animal eat would just cause it more pain and more suffering. In that case, you could tie its mouth shut. It should not be able to eat. Toises Arash, Bava Metzia Daf Tzadik asks, and how do we know that lo tachsem shor bedisha is all about the feeling of the animal? Who says? The Torah doesn't say what the reason is. And this halacha clearly is based on Chazal's understanding. Lo tachsim shor b'disho is about tzar balachayim. When the animal sees grain, or it sees grass, or it sees food, it is the nature of the animal to eat. Did you ever visit a farm? Or were you ever in the Alps and you see those hundreds of cows? What do they do all day? They graze. They graze. They eat. That is their nature. A cow or an oxen can't see food and not eat. So Chazal understood that lo tachsim shor b'disha is because of tzar balachayim. And if we know that letting the animal eat will cause it excessive pain and even more suffering, then the Gemara says there is no Isser. So the Rosh asks, how do we know this is the reasoning? You know, if I would be asked, could you suggest another reason of lo tachsim shor b'disha? I don't know what I would say. I would say Yosef Atzadik is nimshal shor b'chor shoyroi hodoloi. And maybe if we prevent the shor from eating, it is preventing the shefa that comes from Midas HaYesod, and that is Yosef HaTzadik. I don't know what I would say, but you could suggest a lot of different ideas. So the Rosh asks, how does Chazal know this is the reason? And the Rosh says something very interesting and important. The Rosh says, sometimes Chazal, with their ultimate wisdom, understood. There is no other explanation. It is obvious. It is obvious. And when things are obvious and self-evident, we are doirish taamei dikro and taamei mitzvot. And it was clear to Chazal. I mean, this is between a person and an animal. What could the reason be? So Chazal understood. It is all about tzar balachayim, and therefore, if letting the animal eat will cause it more pain and more suffering, then there is no issa of lo tachsim shor b'disha. And a mitzvot I brought about 10 other sources similar to the Taisus Erosh. And therefore, the general rule is Halachic Rabbi Yehuda, lo darshin and taamei dekro. Some mitzvahs the Torah clearly says what is the reasoning. And I differentiated between taamei mitzvot and tachlitan shel mitzvot, between reasons and objectives. And then we spoke about the significance, the weight, the relevance of taamei mitzvahs that we find either by the Jewish philosophers, most notably the Moreh Nevuchim and the Sefer HaChinuch, or the Mekabolim, like the Zohar Kodesh regarding shiluach, haken. And then the last part of our shiur today was about taamei mitzvot that we find in the poskim. And here, b'machilas koyte rasoi, ofer ve'efer anitachas kapas raglav, I would defer with the some sofer, and I would say, Tshuvas HaRashba, Trumas HaDeshen, if they write tamim, those are relevant lahalacha. Otherwise, it wouldn't be Tshuvas HaRashba and Trumas HaDeshen. But maybe for another reason, I would say, HaTorah hishvasa midoiseo, and not always does the reason of a mitzvah dictate its details. And we see in Toisas Erosh Bo B'Metzia Daf Tzadik that in this broad concept, lo darshin and taamei mitzvahs, there are exceptions. And one exception is the Gemara Meforeshes Bo B'Metzia Daf Tzadik regarding lo tachsom shor b'dishoy, and the explanation of the Rosh. Chazal, ba'oimed binosam, uberuach kodsham, with their ultimate wisdom, understood this is the reason of lo tachsim shor b'dishoy. It is all about tzar balachayim, and there is no other reasonable explanation. And therefore, they relied on their understanding and their ruach hakodesh to dictate a kula by a lav dioraisa. A kula by a lav dioraisa. She'ema behema matrezet, then we are allowed to be chosim shor b'dishoy. So this is a very interesting topic. I just discussed part of it. And if any of you want to delve deeper and broader into the sugya, it's in Minchas Osho Parshas Chukas. So this week's parsha is the mitzvah of Pora Aduma. Is there a chumash handy here? So the Torah goes into details regarding the mitzvah of Pura Aduma. And it is one of those mitzvahs that is defined as chukah. Chukim chukakti, gzeres guzarti, ve'en lechu reshus laharher achareihem. Zois chukas ha-Torah. A lot of pages. ויקרא לך פורדון תמים אשר אין במום, אשר לא עולו עולהו אויל, ונסעתם מויסום אלא לא זר הכהן. Yalkut Shimoni, there's an amazing medrash. And it is a novel interpretation of this parsha. And the parsha also refers to our story, to the Jewish story. ויקרא לך פורה אלו ישראל, שנאמר כי פורה סררו סורר ישראל. אדומה אלו ישראל, שנאמר אדמו עצם מפנינים. תמימו אלו ישראל, שנאמר יוינוסי תמוסי, אשר אין במום, אלו ישראל, שנאמר כולך יופו ראיוסי, ומום אין בך. אשר לא יעולו עולי העול, זה דורש של ירמיהו שלא קיבלו עליהם עול מלכות שמיים. ונתת מויסם אל אלעזר הכהן זה ירמיהו ושנאמר מן הכהנים אשר באנוסויס, והוציאו ישראל מחוץ למחנה, that is a reference to Golus. ושוחטו ישראל לפניו, that is a reference to Tzidkiyahu ובוnav, that were murdered and slaughtered in the same day. ושורף es הפורה לעיניו, וישרף es beis Hashem, sreif es beis HaMikdash. So these psukim refer to our story. And then va'osaf es reif es aporo. Va'osaf ze HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Va'osaf nidche Yisrael. Ish ze HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shenemar Hashem ish mochomo. Toher זה הקדוש ברוך הוא דכסיב טוהר עיניים מרעויס ברא ספר הפורה אל הגלויותיהם של ישראל. So this parsha talks about our tragedy and our salvation, about Chorban veGeula. And my feeling is, on this story as well, we say, Chukim chukakti, gzeres guzarti, ve'en lechu reshus laharer achareihem. So one would wonder, we are the chosen people. We are the beloved people. Because Baruch Hu loves us more than all the others. So why do we suffer more than all the others? Why is our story such a painful and tragic story? So thousands of years since we were born, it is only 830 years that we had a Beis HaMikdash. And we had Shechina. Most of our days are days of tragedy, our days of sorrow. And so this Shabbos, we had a Kiddush in our Shiur. Thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Jews rejoiced after the Nisim that we saw in this very short war with Iran. And I spoke about this last week, and we spoke about this many times. I know in many shuls they said Halal, in many shuls they say Nishmas. I am very careful not to add on any tefillas. There are so many ways to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You don't necessarily need to say Halal or saying new tefillas. We had a Kiddush in our shul, and I spoke Divrei Chizuk. But let us not forget, today a soldier was killed in Gaza. This month, we lost 20 young kids in Gaza, 20 young soldiers, 20 families that will never be the same. So on one hand, we do see miracles, we do see Siyata Dishmaya, but it's also a time of terrible pain and tragedy, and it's going on for almost 2 years. So what is our story all about? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us more than anyone else in the world, and He definitely does. חביב וניסול שנקראו בונים למוקים. חיבי הסדר נדס להם שנקראו בונים למוקים. So why do we suffer more than all the others? We've been here before them all. We'll be here after them all. We are the people of eternity. We are the people of miracles. So this is our story according to the Medrash. It's the story, Parshas Chukas, about Golos, about tragedy, and about Geula that will come, B'Korah B'Yameinu. And it is regarding this story as well that Chazal say, Zois Chukas HaTorah. Chukim Chukakti, Gzeres Gezarti, V'yenach Roshus Lara Lachareim. So the ultimate book about suffering and pain and coping with tragedy is Sefer Iyov. And I've learned Iyov and tried to understand what is the message. Sefer Iyov starts with a storm. And the storm tears Iyov's house asunder. His family is destroyed. All his possessions are destroyed. And he sinks into despair. And his friends come to console him. And a lengthy discussion develops, a philosophical discussion and an argument. And they dismally fail to give him chizuk. And the book ends the way it started. Once again a storm, just like the Sefer begins. And out of the storm, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears before Iyov. And he speaks to him directdirectly. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks some piercing questions. Starting off, Eifo hayita biosdi aretz. Hagedna im yadata bino. Were you there when I created the world? Were you there? Al ma adanei Yehud ba'u, o mi yara even pinoso. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks, haniglu lecho sharei moves, v'sharei tzel mavet tir'eh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Iyov, you and your friends have it all wrong. You're trying to understand what you cannot understand. You're trying to understand what you will never understand. Your challenge is to accept what you cannot understand, not trying to figure it out. Chukim chokakti gzeres gezarti, ve'en lecho reshus lahara lachareim. Asher Hashem yohav Hashem yochiach. Kodesh Baruch Hu always loves us, even when we are in pain. This is something we don't understand, and we shouldn't try to understand. At the end of days, looking back, we will understand. So the Gemara says in Masechet Pesachim, Lo ki yolam hazeh olam habo. B'yolam hazeh toiv mevorach borach hatoiv ha'meitev, al haro mevorach borach dayan emes, lo osed lo al hakol mevorach hatoiv ha'meitev. And the Gemara is strange. Is the difference between olam hazeh and olam habo, does the difference manifest itself only in the brachas? This world is a world of pain, of suffering, of trials and tribulations. The coming world is a olam shekulei toiv, olam shekuma orach. All our pains will go away. It'll be a utopian world of bliss, of blessing. There will be no pain. So why does the Gemara say the difference is what brachas we say? In this world, ala toiv mevorach hatoiv ha'meitev, ala haro mevorach borach dayan emes, lo osed lo ala kol mevorach borach dayan emes, ala kol mevorach borach hatoiv ha'meitev. My pshat is this. I said this many years ago, and I wrote it in the introduction to the first sefer I printed, Minchas Osham Baba Basla. And then I found it in the Tzlach HaPesuchim, brings it b'shem HaMagid, Reb Ephraim Mereisha, and I don't know who that was. Lo osed lavoi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take each and every one of us, turn them around, and now look back at the Golos. What do you see now? And all we will see is Rachamei Shamayim. Lo osed lavoi ala kol mevarech hatov ha'meitev. And that very same phenomena that we already said dayan emes, and the very same events which broke our hearts, and we cried oceans of tears, and those very same events, looking back, we will say Borach HaToiv HaMeitav. How? Why? I don't know. We cannot know. And that is the message of Iyov. when after this lengthy discourse and discussion, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears and says, were you there when I created the world? You don't understand the Seidas of Brias Oilam. This is something beyond the means of human understanding. And this is what the Medrash indicates. So the mitzvah of Pora Aduma is also a remez to the story of the Jews. Chorma Bayis, and ultimately, V'osaf ish toher, esreifes apora, el mokom toher, ze Yerushalayim. And that'll be the end of days. And on this story as well, the Pasuk says, Zois chukas ha-Torah, chukim chukakti, gzeres guzarti, ve'en ha-chorishus la'alachareim. And that's the Nesoyan of Amunah. And Metochen, we believe. We believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us. And ultimately, when time will come, and we will be Zeicha to the Gula Shalema, it is only then that we will understand our story. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu should only give us Besodas Toivos. We should be able to say a lot of Baruch HaTov HaMeitevs and no longer Baruch Dayan Emes. We should only have Besodas Toivos in Yeshuas and HaChames, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should take this war away. And Ishtachas Gafnoi ve'Ishtachas Teinasoi ve'Tishkoi Ta'oretz ve'Shechaftem ve'ein ve'Notati Shalom ba'oretz ve'Shechaftem ve'ein Machrid. We should be Mavasa Besodas Toivos, and we should be Zercha B'Korah B'Yomeinu to see Pnei Moshiach Tzedkeinu b'Mheiro v'Yomeinu Amen.